other capacity or right. So all of a sudden we have us here as human beings, and when we connect to a legal system, we as a human being are recognized as a natural person, but we as a human being can actually be also recognized as an artificial person. You getting confused yet? You know, it's really confusing. Who are we? And when do these things actually come into play? Okay, so this idea of being two persons at once, or three persons, or really 10 persons in law, is a reality in law, whether it's a reality around our dinner table. Okay, so we'll move on from there, so it'll help us. So now let's go look at for this artificial person's property rights. What you'll find this is in the Federal Interpretation Act. It goes powers vested in corporations. Now in the Federal Interpretation Act, the word corporation itself means all artificial persons, not just incorporated companies. Okay? So it goes 21.1 goes, words establishing a corporation shall be construed, which means it must be construed, as vesting in the corporation power to sue and be sued, to contract and to be contracted with, by its corporate name. So he becomes virtually like you in his ability to interact in law. To have a common seal and to alter or change it at its pleasure, okay, and to have perpetual succession. This is one element we don't have. But these guys can live on forever. Okay, here's where it's relative to property though. To acquire and hold personal property for the purposes for which the corporation is established, and to alienate that property at pleasure. So, when we look at these artificial persons, their property rights come out of the Interpretation Act, at least on the federal level. Okay, so they can hold property, acquire it, but they can only acquire it, but when they do acquire it, guess what it's subject to? The piece of legislation which created the artificial person for it. Okay, so that's why in some laws, you feel you have different rights than when other laws are applicable. And then it can go on, but it can also sell it whenever it wants. So that's really where the artificial person's property rights are. So let's look on the natural person's property rights. Okay? We'll go back to the charter here. Now here's a section you will never, I even have a book of, I forget the guy's credentials, explaining the charter, in-depth charter. Guess which one section he forgot to talk about? Other than a real brief mention about it in the preamble to the whole section of discussing it, was section 26. It goes here, it goes, the guarantee in this charter of certain rights and freedoms shall not be construed as denying the existence of any other rights or freedoms that existed in Canada. Now, if they really talked about that, would that not cause you to maybe think, what do you mean? We might have had some rights before the charter? Okay, so the question is, did we have any property rights before the introduction of the charter in 1982? Okay, and that's what we need to go back into our history and look at that. A great place to stop here is the Canadian Bill of Rights. Now, the Canadian Bill of Rights, I'll give it to you in a nutshell. It's a statute. It was passed by Parliament and it can be repealed by Parliament. But all of those things are irrelevant because all the Canadian Bill of Rights does is express principles of fundamental law that existed prior to the Canadian Bill of Rights. Okay, so what we're having an opportunity by having the Canadian Bill of Rights is getting a legal overview as to what rights we did have before the passing of the Canadian Bill of Rights. I'm going to read the preamble because it really helps show the balance of human rights relative to our system. Okay, it's an act for the recognition and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Okay, the preamble goes, the Parliament of Canada, affirming that the Canadian nation is founded upon principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, the dignity and the worth of the human person, and the position of the family in a society of free men and free institutions. Affirming also that men and institutions remain free only when freedom is founded upon respect for moral and spiritual values and the rule of law. See, freedom isn't free. Freedom comes in the balance of respecting others. So it's a very important paragraph there. So it goes on, finishes off here, goes, and be desirous of enshrining these principles and the human rights and fundamental freedoms derived of them in a Bill of Rights, which shall reflect the respect of Parliament for its constitutional authority, and which shall ensure the protection of these rights and freedoms in Canada. So here we have a Bill of Rights that's saying we do have rights. So let's move on to the next section and see what are they. Can we find a natural person's right to property? Section 1, the recognition and declaration of rights and freedoms. It goes, it is hereby recognized and declared that in Canada there have existed and shall continue to exist without discrimination by reason of race, national origin, color, religion, or sex, the following human rights and fundamental freedoms, namely. And the word namely is there because it's an inexhaustible list. So the first section they have is the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of person, and the enjoyment of property. So lo and behold, we do have property rights. Now we look at this and say, yeah, but no, we don't have property rights. We only have the right to enjoy it. Okay, well think about it. If someone had the ability to go and take half your property, do with it what they want, make a law, do you get to enjoy that when it's gone? To have enjoyment of property inherently comes with being able to have an absolute right to it. So that's actually supported if we go way back into Canada's history, back to the Blackstone commentaries, and look at what Lord Blackstone had to say about absolute rights. Lord Blackstone, okay, was the Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas of England, the common law court system during the middle of the 18th century. In one essence, he wrote 4 books. In one essence, you can say he was the father of common law, the father of human rights in one essence. Not that they didn't exist before there, but he took the time to really explain the differences between their rights and your rights. So in one of his books, he goes, Lord Blackstone named the 3 absolute rights as being the right of personal liberty, the right of personal security, and the right to property. So an artificial property comes from statutes, 21(1), I believe, of the Federal Interpretation Act. A natural person's property rights have existed and shall continue to exist since before the creation of Canada. So it comes in one essence, you can condense, comes from the common law. Comes from that self-evident reality, comes from the biblical principles that, how do you say, if we never had the right to property, why would you have a command that says, thou shalt not steal? Wouldn't that be an oxymoron? Okay, that's where our property rights comes in. Okay, so now that we've divided that up, let's go and look at this back relative to the Charter. So are there property rights in the Charter? The answer is no. Not because we don't have any, but because everyone's property rights are different. An artificial person's property rights is granted by statute, and therefore it can be deprived of its property at the will of its creator, the government. Whereas a natural person's property right is a gift from our Creator, and we cannot be deprived of our property except through due process of law. When we commit a crime, violate someone else's rights. So what we really have here, if we want to sort of visualize it a little bit better, is all these artificial persons have what we'll call personal property, and natural persons have private property. Now, how do you tell the difference between what you own or you think you own, whether it's personal, which means it's subject to statute, which means you actually don't own it, or whether it's private, which means the only way they can deprive you of it is through due process of law. Okay? There's 2 ways, but one key way is very clear, but the other way is through what's called a right of claim. If you as a natural person are acting and represent one of these artificial persons, and you have a piece of property, regardless of what it is, and while you're acting in that capacity, you say, that's my property. Whose property is it now? That's right, because guess what? There's nobody else saying, no, it's making another right of claim to it. Okay, so it becomes very important to know what you're saying and which capacity you're saying it. Another way is through registration. And it's very... if you have the absolute right to property, where no one, as long as you're not using it to cause harm to other people, to hurt anyone else, what's wrong with it? It is your right and it is recognized, and the only way is through due process of law. Well, have you ever registered any of your property? Usually they're the big ticket items in your life. Okay? Have you registered a car? Have you registered your house? Have you noticed how they can tell you what to do in your car? Or really, is it in their car? You see the difference of property rights relative to who we are in this legal system. Okay, so I mean, this leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Did we have to register it? Well, of course they'll say you do. And so we either, one, take their word for it, or we go and we look to see if we already have an absolute right to it, what legal mechanism forces us to it. And usually what they do when we register it is they attach a benefit to it. So registration is neither good or bad. if you want the benefit in exchange for relinquishing your right to that property. Okay? But when it's over here, it is private property. So let's get back to